Hi, I'm Eliza Moore. I am the Senior Environmental Scientist for the Narragansett Bay Commission, and today I'm going to be talking to you about our efforts to restore Upper Narragansett Bay water quality through CSO abatement. The Narragansett Bay Commission is the owner and operator of the two largest wastewater treatment facilities in Rhode Island. We're located here around Providence, and we serve the surrounding towns as well as the city, and we sit at the headwaters of Narragansett Bay. Our sewer system is pretty old, dating back to the 1870s for certain portions. And back in those days, sewers were first built to capture waste not only from homes and businesses, but also the runoff from streets, which would have included things like horse waste at the time. And the goal was simply to get these wastes into a pipe and divert that pipe to the nearest river or stream to wash it away and get it out of the cities as fast as possible. Now, this is an image showing what the city of Providence looked like in 1896, and needless to say, population was pretty dense already, and so this system didn't work very well for very long. And we started to see people getting very sick in the early 1900s due to that contamination in the rivers and downstream shellfishing beds. And so a new series of pipes was installed to intercept those combined sewer system pipes and redirect the flow to a centralized wastewater treatment facility at Fields Point, which is where our largest plant still sits today. Now, the original CSO outfall points were left in place as emergency discharges for cases when rainstorms inundated the system. We certainly don't want to see sewage backing up into homes or businesses or streets. But of course, discharges of untreated waste like this through the CSOs are violations of the Clean Water Act and pose a public health risk. So the NBC has been working to mitigate this risk over the last several decades through the CSO Abatement Project. This major infrastructure project is being approached in 3 phases, and this early planning schematic kind of shows that layout where phase 1 region is shown in pink, phase 2 in this yellow-green, and phase 3 in blue. And I'm going to talk more about each of these in a few minutes. But the overall goal here is to reduce CSO discharges to a point where water quality is supporting fishing uses of these waters as well as swimming. And right now they're considered impaired due to the bacteria counts. Now, this map is showing the individual locations of CSO discharge points in our district, and phase 1 of CSO abatement addressed the CSOs shown in pink. When I say addressed, some of the CSOs would have been sealed completely, but in most cases we're talking about infrastructure upgrades upstream to reduce the amount of flow coming to these points and reduce the frequency, likelihood, magnitude of discharges through the CSOs, although they still remain, again, as emergency discharge points. The star of phase 1 was the phase 1 tunnel. This is a 3-mile-long tunnel built under the city of Providence that can store up to 65 million gallons of combined sewer flows during heavy rain events. So instead of these flows going out into the local rivers, they are diverted into the tunnel where they're stored until the treatment plant can pump them out and give them full advanced secondary treatment plus disinfection. And the great thing about the tunnel is it's capturing the first flush from these storms. There are cases where a big rainstorm comes in and the tunnel fills, and so we will still see discharges through the CSOs, but by that point, it should be pretty dilute runoff, and that first flush with the heaviest pollutant load would have been captured. So following phase 1, the NBC did put out a report summarizing some water quality outcomes. And one of our findings was that the phase 1 tunnel captures approximately 50% of all CSO flows in the district. And again, since it's capturing the first flush, presumably this is capturing more than 50% of the pollutant load. In addition, some restoration of shellfishing access was achieved. The State Department of Environmental Management in 2011 relaxed some restrictions on shellfishing areas just south of the Providence River that are closed following certain rainfall amounts. They lifted the amount of rainfall necessary to initiate a closure to allow more open shellfishing days per year. And these are highly productive shellfishing beds, particularly for quahogs. So CSO phase 2 was completed in June 2015 and addressed the CSOs shown in green on this map. It included additional tie-ins to the phase 1 tunnel, as well as sewer separation projects where the sewage portion and the stormwater component are separated from via the infrastructure. So now the only thing that will discharge through the pipe is separate stormwater. In addition, we have this constructed wetland facility that was used at one CSO where the excess flows will now flow into some storage tanks and only what exceeds that storage amount will overflow into the nearby wetland for some filtration before it enters the local river. Just to touch on phase 3 briefly, this is going to address the remainder of the CSOs shown in blue here. It's focused in the Buckland Point district and will consist of another deep storage tunnel along the Blackstone River. And this is going to be breaking ground soon. It's the final phase of the project, and there will also be some green infrastructure projects to address the remaining CSOs separate from that tunnel. The remainder of my talk is going to focus on phase 2 water quality improvements. We are in the process of working on a comprehensive report to summarize water quality outcomes like we did for phase 1, and that will eventually be on our website. But one piece of restoration we can already point to is, again, shellfishing regulations were relaxed. So this is the area I was describing a couple slides ago. The Providence River, shown in red, is closed for shellfishing, but just south of there are these conditional areas closed after certain amounts of rainfall. So conditional area B, which is the dark green, was actually reclassified in 2017 as approved. So this area no longer closes following rain events. Conditional area A and the other remaining conditional areas in this location also saw further relaxation of those rainfall limits. So we're seeing some realized restoration following these 2 phases of CSO abatement. The remainder of my talk is going to focus on our bacteria monitoring efforts. So since about 2004, the NBC has routinely monitored for fecal coliform and enterococci bacteria in our receiving waters, including the freshwater rivers and the estuarine rivers. We sample the freshwater river sites 1 to 2 times per week, whereas the bay sites are sampled twice per month typically. And the reason for that disparity is that the freshwater rivers, we're monitoring more closely for potential blockages in the sewage system and dry weather overflows or overflows of sewage when there hasn't been any rain. So each of the freshwater rivers has a site that is upstream of all CSO influence, as well as sites downstream to kind of pinpoint where a potential problem might be located. So today, the figures I'll show you are some preliminary data analysis looking at the geometric means of just fecal coliform data here, as well as standard error. And all of the data has been grouped based on the phase, where pre-phase 1 is all of our monitoring data up through the completion of the tunnel in 2008. Post-phase 1 lasts until the completion of phase 2 in June 2015. And then post-phase 2, we've cut off at the end of last year for this analysis. I'm only showing data that sample data that were collected on wet weather sample days. So these are days where it was rainy that day or on the previous 3 days. And that's because this is when we expect to see the greatest impact of CSO abatement. Lastly, on the next few slides, you'll see a red dashed line, which is indicating some state criteria for primary contact. And it's important for me to note this is only for comparison purposes. The state uses a very different analysis method to evaluate whether a site is meeting water quality criteria for primary contact. So we can't really say anything about compliance here, just pointing it out for informational purposes. Looking first here at the Woonasquatucket River. We have our 3 sites, W9, which is upstream of all CSO influence, and going down to W7A, which is right before the confluence with the Mashasik River. And we see that a couple CSOs on this river were addressed as part of phase 1, but most were addressed as part of phase 2. In general, bacteria counts are lowest at our most upstream site, which is what we would expect. And we see at those downstream sites a pretty stepwise decline in bacteria following each phase of abatement. One thing to note, if we look at that primary contact criterion in the red dashed line, our downstream sites, even after phase 2, are still exhibiting pretty elevated bacteria counts. And so this could be due to stormwater runoff separate from CSOs. This is a very urbanized area, and that could be a possibility. And we also occasionally run into illicit connections or areas where construction projects have connected sewage lines to separate storm lines or otherwise directly to the river. And so occasionally we run into that. Moving now into the Providence River estuary itself, now think about or keep in mind that the most upstream sites, PR12 and PR8, are now closest to CSO influence, whereas the further we get downstream or to the right on the x-axis, we're getting further away from CSO influence and more to the open bay waters. So as expected, our upstream sites closest to CSO influence and closest to the city center do have our highest bacteria counts, and we do see some stepwise declines in bacteria following each phase of CSO abatement. We're going to zoom in a little bit now on these lower Providence River sites, just to get a look at that spread in data. And here we have the primary contact criterion again. This is a little bit lower than the freshwater criterion for the Woonasquatucket, because now we're in saltwater. But the important thing to note is some of our southern sites here are showing much reduced bacteria counts following phase 2, more frequently falling under that criterion. So again, it doesn't indicate compliance with the primary contact criteria, but it does indicate that we're getting closer to that being a possibility. One of the interesting things we noticed with the phase 1 report is that we saw bacteria reductions where we didn't necessarily anticipate them. So here we're looking at the Blackstone River site data, and BL2, which is far upstream of all CSO influence, as well as BL3, downstream of CSOs, but none of these CSOs have been addressed yet. They're all being planned for phase 3. But despite that, we see a really steep decline in bacteria following phase 1, and then another decline following phase 2. And so a couple things could potentially be explaining this pattern. This is a really big watershed for the Blackstone River. It extends all the way up into the city of Worcester, Massachusetts. There's a lot of dams and industry along this line, and as well as residential areas and farms. And so lots of different things can be contributing to the change in bacteria counts besides CSO abatement. And some of the ways we do know we could be seeing impacts is through stormwater mitigation, as well as reductions in dry weather overflows. So the NBC and other agencies and businesses around the region are working on improved stormwater control and treatment. And since the NBC has been doing this bacteria monitoring in our rivers, we've seen a really steep decline in dry weather overflows. So each of these things kind of confounds the CSO story, but they're all really important parts of the restoration efforts for this region. So just a couple closing thoughts here. Phases 1 and 2 of the CSO Abatement Project are contributing to the restoration of water quality, shellfishing access, and recreation in these urban upper reaches of Narragansett Bay. And we've learned some best practices through this program, including it's always a good time to start long-term monitoring and routine monitoring. Once you get to a point where you want to know what historical data look like, you either have it or you don't. So, you know, if your program can start doing some routine monitoring, it's always a good idea. It's also very important to be investing in CSO flow monitoring technology. The NBC has always had flow meters at our CSO locations, but we've had varying success over the years with the different technology. And so we're constantly looking to see if that technology is improving or looking for ways that we can improve our success there. In addition, we've learned some lessons where these concurrent efforts to improve water quality through stormwater mitigation and dry weather overflow prevention does muddy our ability to tell the CSO abatement story specifically. Again, still important to use all the tools in our arsenal to protect these waters. And through CSO abatement, we're seeing clearly that CSOs are not the only problem with bacterial impairment. Once CSO abatement is complete, we still have other things to address, like stormwater runoff and illicit connections in the city. So just finally, our comprehensive phase 2 report is going to include some more detailed data analysis and explorations, like looking at different ways to define wet weather using different rain gauges throughout the region, different antecedent rain amounts to evaluate that, and also looking more site by site to really hone in on different infrastructure improvements and how we might expect to see water quality changes following those. So with that, I will acknowledge that many other departments and staff at the NBC contributed to this project and contribute every day to protecting the water quality of Narragansett Bay, and I thank them for that. And my email address is here. If you have any questions, I welcome those, and you can also visit our website for all of our monitoring data. Thank you.